All right, joining me now here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Larry Hancock. Larry is the author of the new book, Shadow Warfare, The History of America's Undeclared Wars. Larry, thank you so much for being on the show.
It's a pleasure.
All right, so Larry, let's begin our conversation with the title of the book. If people aren't aware, describe for them what exactly is shadow warfare.
A shadow warfare basically could be called deniable warfare, deniable action, clandestine, black warfare, a lot of terms that go with it. Basically, it occurs when the president decides to direct an action that is not going to be public, that is going to be deniable, and in which Congress does not directly authorize.
And it's interesting because you actually write in the book, and like many people know this, we actually haven't actually declared war in the United States since like 1941, correct?
And yes, that's rather amazing considering the number of pretty obvious wars that we fought.
Right.
Most people don't realize that even after 2001, we didn't actually declare war on anyone.
Right. Well, let's get into sort of the angle of actually the history of this, because it goes back a long way. What are the earliest known instances that you know of, that we know of, about actual shadow warfare that our government actually carried out?
Probably the earliest that we deal with that's more of contemporary nature is actually what President Roosevelt did in the year before World War II began, before Pearl Harbor, and he actually launched an initiative which, if it had come about as planned, would have resulted in American pilots flying Chinese bombers to bomb Japan well before Pearl Harbor, and the whole thought was that it would prove to the Japanese that they were vulnerable and discourage them from the path that they were moving towards war in the Pacific. And so that was a very sophisticated black warfare project long before the CIA, before the history that we think about. And everybody's probably, or many people are familiar with the Flying Tigers, which were the fighter element of his effort, but actually there was a bomber group that was supposed to be formed, and the pilots for that bomber group were on the way to China from San Francisco on December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked.
So that operation was in motion, and had Pearl Harbor not occurred, theoretically that probably would have gone forward.
That was certainly Roosevelt's intention. The only thing that stalled it, and it had been stalled for a number of months, was that they were so busy providing bombers to the British that the bombers they had planned on using were going to Britain rather than to China, and that was the only thing that delayed it. But certainly he was very much behind that program.
Well, it all kind of, I mean, so that's kind of the earliest known instance of that, but it also tended to really explode and grow exponentially during the Cold War. Let's really dig into that, because that's a major portion of your book is actually spent on that time, because that's when a lot of the mechanisms in place, a lot of the organizations that do it were kind of created in that time. Talk about that and how these shadow organizations that carry these out actually came into being here.
You bet. And a lot of it actually evolved early on and will surprise most people under President Eisenhower, because you really just don't associate that with President Eisenhower. But what really gave it its impetus is that Eisenhower was very interested in pushing to get back against perceived communist aggression. But in the beginning, he was not intending to go the covert deniable route. In particular, he wanted to support the French in Indochina and oppose communist advance. At that point in time, China had just gone communist, was very frightened about how far they might move in Southeast Asia, and he wanted to join the battle against communist expansion in Asia. And he went to Congress. He had a major lobbying effort in Congress, and Congress just wasn't interested in another war at that point in time. He tried to put together an international alliance and that failed. Actually, even the French and British weren't too excited. And in the end, he resorted to covert action, sending supplies and personnel to Indochina and actually planning for a major bombing attack in Indochina, which he is on record of telling people who are close to him that if we did it, we would have to deny it forever. So a lot of the practices and the turn to covert warfare actually occurred under Eisenhower when he couldn't make the system work. That's not where he went first, but more and more when his State Department couldn't make it, John Foster Dulles couldn't convince Congress or allies to do conventional action, he began to turn to John's brother Allen Dulles and go the covert route with the CIA.
So let's delve into, I guess, some of the kind of the side of this that's I think kind of the most interesting, and that is the supposed legality of all these actions, or in my opinion, the illegality of all these actions. Because there are laws that they claim to take these covert secret actions under, but it's a stretch in a lot of cases. Talk about kind of the history of the legality and the legal arguments that go through this.
Yeah. Fundamentally, all of these types of actions are sanctioned under the national security legislation of 1947, which was very inclusive. It was written primarily for intelligence collection, but there is wording in there that extends that. It's kind of like the message that says all of this is involved plus anything else you need to do. It's very, very vague. And actually, it's so confusing that Eisenhower had to go to his own Justice Department for an interpretation. But the bottom line is the legality, even up to contemporary times, everything that's done is based in that legislation from 1947, and it's not been modified nor extended or challenged in the Supreme Court. It still exists. So there's a lot of history there, and there's legal code that supports it. That first legislation did not even require the presidents to advise Congress. And I think that's sort of a fascinating thing. It gave the president the authority to issue directives for covert action without even informing Congress at all. It was only after Vietnam, after a lot of the things that happened in the 60s and early 70s, that Congress stepped in and passed some legislation that at least said, if you're going to do this, you need to tell us. It still didn't give them any power to say no, but it said at least you have to tell us, which is sometimes presidents chose to do that before, sometimes after, and on occasion they actually said, well, I intended to tell you guys, but it just slipped my mind. That's a classic Reagan thing where it actually it's like I made a mental communication about it and everybody went, what? Okay. But so I think that, again, surprises people. Congress really plays a game with this. The thing is, this allows Congress to say, well, the president's at fault if he doesn't tell us, but, if it doesn't work correctly, then it's his problem. We don't have any responsibility. They have a lot of options. If they really didn't like it, they could, pass legislation. But Congress is really good at dumping it back on the president. And, it kind of stands out that this is a hypocritical thing because they certainly could pass new legislation, but they don't. They primarily just use it for political advantage. Either way, either party. And that has not changed. What makes it worse, actually, is that there are two other things from a legal standpoint that have occurred. One, early on in the earliest days, there began to be what were called understandings between the Central Intelligence Agency and the Justice Department, which actually permitted the CIA to have its officers do things with other people, with surrogates, with what are called assets, that would have been considered illegal even under that 1947 legislation. But as long as the officers themselves weren't doing it, they didn't have to report that their people were doing it. And
like what's an example? Like give a couple examples of what those actions might actually be.
Probably the most dramatic example is one of those understandings came about in regard to the activities in Nicaragua, where there was widespread media attention to the fact that it appeared to some of the Contras that the U.S. was supporting were actually very much involved with bringing drugs into the United States. There were some media folks who really broke that story, and it came to be called the Dark Alliance story, if your listeners have ever heard of that. And, of course, the CIA denied it. And as it turns out, that was actually investigated by Senator Kerry. And Kerry committee documented that it was indeed occurring, and the CIA responded, well, maybe it was, but we didn't tell them to do it. And only later, in 1998, did the Inspector General of the CIA himself reveal the fact that there had been an understanding with the Justice Department from the earliest days that the CIA was not required to report activities of the people they were working with that involved drugs, which totally undercut their whole denial. So you can see that that kind of understanding really defeats basically all the legal code that's in place when you go, well, we're not going to do anything illegal, we're just going to work with people who are doing something illegal, and even though the law says we have to report it, we all agree that we don't, okay?